I thought it was just going to be a normal Saturday, helping an old friend clear out some dusty boxes in her garage, maybe finding a few forgotten treasures, sharing a laugh or two. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The air was heavier, almost as if it carried secrets. She greeted me with a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. As we moved things around, I noticed her fingers linger on certain objects, her gaze drift to corners as though she was staring into memories I couldn't see. The sound of shifting boxes echoed in the quiet, and every now and then, she'd pause, just long enough for me to wonder what was running through her mind. I told myself it was nothing, just a normal day. But deep down, I could feel something pressing in, a story she hadn't told yet, and maybe didn't want to. I didn't know it then, but by the end of the day, one question from her would change everything. The morning started quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you notice every little sound, the crunch of gravel under my shoes, the low hum of the breeze, the faint creak of the old wooden fence as I walked up to her house. Clara was standing in the driveway, waiting for me, one hand tucked into her sweater sleeve, the other wrapped around a steaming mug. She smiled when she saw me, but it was a small smile, almost careful, like she had to remind herself to do it. I waved and called out a greeting, but even from a distance, I could tell something about her felt different. She had always been lively, the kind of person who laughed with her whole body, but today her movements were slower, her eyes a little shadowed. We said our hellos, and she led me toward the garage. The door groaned as it rolled up, revealing a space frozen in time, stacks of boxes leaning against each other like tired old friends, tools scattered across a dusty workbench, and shelves sagging under the weight of forgotten things. The smell of old wood, cardboard, and something faintly metallic hit me all at once. I stepped inside, brushing a strand of cobweb from my shoulder, and for a moment it felt like stepping into another world. Clara handed me a pair of worn work gloves. "It's a mess," she said softly, almost apologetically, and I could hear something in her tone, something more than embarrassment about the clutter. We started with the boxes closest to the door, filled mostly with books and papers that had yellowed with age. Some were water-stained, their spines curling. She picked up each one slowly, like she was deciding whether it deserved to stay or be thrown away, and I couldn't help but notice her hands linger on some longer than others. At one point, she pulled out an old photo frame with the glass cracked. I leaned over to see, but she quickly placed it face down in a box and moved on. I didn't ask. The sound of shifting boxes and the occasional cough from the dust filled the silence between us. Every so often, she would glance at me, as if checking to see if I noticed something, or maybe if I didn't. I tried to keep things light, telling her about a ridiculous thing that had happened at work earlier in the week, but my words seemed to bounce off the walls and fade without touching her. She smiled politely, but her eyes were somewhere else entirely. We found a box of old kitchenware, chipped plates, mismatched cups, a dented kettle, and she laughed softly, saying she used to make tea with that kettle in the winter when the power went out. Her voice had a warmth to it for a moment, but then it faded again, and she set the kettle aside with a sigh. The deeper we went into the garage, the more I began to notice the way the light filtered in through the small window near the ceiling, casting long, dusty beams that made everything look older, softer, yet somehow heavier. There was a stillness to the space, like the air had been holding its breath for years. At one point, I caught her just standing there, holding a box but not moving, her gaze fixed on a far corner where a stack of old crates sat untouched. She didn't seem to notice me watching her. I cleared my throat, and she blinked, almost startled, before setting the box down and moving on. We worked like that for a while, side by side but not quite together. The only real conversation was about where to put things, keep, donate, throw away. But in between the words, there was something else being said, something I couldn't quite name yet. I had come here thinking I was helping her with a simple chore, but the way she moved, the way she handled each item, made me feel like I was walking through pieces of a story she wasn't ready to tell. I didn't push. I figured if she wanted to talk, she would. Still, every time she paused for a second too long or sighed without realizing it, I felt the question forming in my mind, what happened here? But I kept my head down, moving another box, wiping the dust from my hands, and telling myself this was just about cleaning a garage. Somewhere deep down, though, I already knew it wasn't. We had been working for a while, the rhythm of lifting, sorting, and stacking settling into something almost mechanical, when Clara reached for a box near the back of a sagging shelf. It was heavier than it looked, and I stepped forward to help her pull it down. The cardboard was soft in places, weakened by time, and as we lowered it to the floor, the bottom sagged and a few things spilled out. A bundle of photographs, tied loosely with twine, slid across the dusty concrete. I knelt down to gather them, brushing the dirt away with my thumb, but before I could see much, Clara crouched beside me and took the stack into her hands. She hesitated for just a second, enough for me to catch a glimpse of the top photo. It showed her standing in a sunlit field, hair loose, laughing at someone just out of frame. She looked so alive in that picture, so different from the quiet, careful woman beside me now. I said something about how happy she looked, expecting her to smile, but instead she let out a short breath, almost a sigh, and slid the photo to the bottom of the stack. We placed the box between us and began going through its contents. There were more photos, some in envelopes, some loose, edges curling from years of storage. A few had people I recognized, her parents, an old mutual friend, but many showed faces I had never seen before. Some were faded, colors washed into soft tones, but the expressions on the people's faces felt vivid, almost alive. Clara's hand slowed each time she came across a certain man who appeared in several pictures. I didn't ask who he was, though the curiosity itched at me. She tucked those photos aside, separate from the rest, and there was a subtle stiffness in her shoulders that told me not to press. Beneath the photos, there were small mementos, ticket stubs, a dried flower pressed between two pieces of wax paper, a postcard with handwriting that had blurred in places. She turned the postcard over, stared at it for a long time, then placed it back into the box with a kind of reverence, as if setting down something fragile. I asked if she wanted to take a break, but she shook her head. "Let's just get through this one," she murmured. Her voice was low, almost absent-minded. As we sorted, the light from the high window shifted, casting the garage in a warmer glow. Dust swirled lazily in the air, settling on our clothes and in our hair. I noticed she kept glancing toward the open doorway, as if making sure no one was there, even though we were alone. At one point, I reached into the bottom of the box and pulled out a small album. The cover was cracked and peeling, the kind of faux leather that crumbles over time. Clara's hand shot out, stopping me before I could open it. "Not that one," she said quickly, her eyes locking on mine. The firmness in her voice startled me. For a moment, we just stayed like that, her hand over mine, the album between us, her eyes holding something sharp and almost desperate. Then, she took it gently from my grasp and set it aside. "It's nothing," she added, but it didn't sound convincing. We moved on without saying much more. She found an old scarf that had belonged to her mother, and for a moment, her face softened, a faint smile touching her lips. She wrapped it loosely around her fingers, almost absently, as if holding it connected her to something, or someone, she missed. Then she placed it carefully in a keep pile. The rest of the box was filled with papers and random objects that seemed less important, but the air between us had shifted. It felt heavier now, as if the act of touching these old pieces of her life had stirred something that couldn't be put back. I found myself watching her more closely, catching the way her jaw tightened when she saw certain things, the way her breathing changed when she lingered too long on an item. We didn't talk about it, but we both felt it, that slow, quiet unveiling of something she had kept buried. When the box was finally empty, she stood up and brushed her hands off, her eyes lingering on the small pile of photos she had set apart. Without looking at me, she said softly, "Some things don't belong in the trash, no matter how much you wish they did." Her words hung there for a moment, and then she picked up another box as if nothing had been said, leaving me with the image of that sunlit photo still in my mind and the growing feeling that today was going to be about much more than cleaning a garage. We had made it halfway through the clutter when we reached the far back corner of the garage, the part that seemed untouched for years. The air was thicker there, the light dimmer, as if even the sun hadn't bothered to reach that spot in a long time. Boxes were stacked higher, dust clung to them in layers, and cobwebs draped from the shelves like ghostly curtains. Clara hesitated as we approached, her steps slowing, her eyes darting briefly to mine before looking away. There, pushed against the wall, was a large, old trunk, dark wood with brass corners tarnished to a dull green, its surface scratched and scuffed with the marks of time. A rusty padlock hung from the latch, the kind of lock you'd expect on something meant to be hidden. I glanced at her, silently asking if we should open it, and she stood there for a long moment, chewing the inside of her cheek, before finally sighing and pulling a small key from the pocket of her jeans. She held it out to me without a word. I knelt down, the metal of the lock cool and gritty under my fingers. It took a little effort, but with a click, it opened, and the lid creaked loudly as I pushed it up. Inside was a strange collection of items, neatly folded pieces of fabric, a stack of letters tied with a faded red ribbon, and several small trinkets that looked like they'd once been cherished. The air inside the trunk smelled faintly of cedar and something older, almost sweet, like perfume that had long faded. I reached for the letters, curious, but Clara crouched beside me, her hand resting lightly on my arm. "Careful," she said, her voice softer than before. I noticed her eyes scanning the contents like she was preparing herself to face each one. She picked up a small silver locket and held it in her palm. It had tiny dents, like it had been dropped more than once. She opened it briefly, glanced inside, then snapped it shut and placed it gently back. I couldn't see what was inside. Underneath the letters was a small, worn box with a loose lid. I reached for it without thinking, but before I could lift it, Clara's hand closed over mine, firmer this time. Her expression changed, there was a flicker of panic there, quick but unmistakable. "Not that," she said quietly, almost pleading. She took the box from me and held it close, her fingers curling around it protectively. She didn't explain, and I didn't ask, though every part of me wanted to. The silence between us deepened, filled only by the distant hum of traffic outside and the occasional creak of the wooden beams overhead. I sat back on my heels, watching as she carefully removed the stack of letters. The ribbon holding them together was frayed, its once bright red faded to a muted pink. She ran her fingers over the top envelope, tracing the handwriting as if it were something alive. She didn't open them, though, she just held them for a moment before placing them aside in a separate pile. At the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in cloth, was a small ceramic figurine of a dancer, her skirt flared mid-spin, one arm raised. A fine crack ran through it, but it hadn't broken completely. Clara smiled faintly when she saw it, a sad sort of smile, and whispered, "She used to sit on my windowsill." I didn't know who she meant, and she didn't elaborate. We continued sifting through the rest, old notebooks, a few photographs without frames, some jewelry that had tarnished with time. Every so often, she would pause, her gaze lingering on something, then shake her head and move on, as if deciding not to share whatever memory had surfaced. When we finally reached the bottom, Clara sat back, looking at the trunk like it was a puzzle she'd never be able to fully solve. "It's strange," she murmured, "how something can hold so much of you and yet feel like it belongs to someone else." I didn't know if she was talking to me or to herself. We left the items in neat piles beside the trunk, but the box she had taken from me earlier stayed in her hands. She didn't set it down, didn't even loosen her grip. As she stood, the light from the small window caught the edge of her face, and for a second, I thought I saw something in her eyes, not fear exactly, but a guardedness, like someone standing in a doorway deciding whether to let you in. Without saying anything more, she walked past me and set the trunk aside so we could move the boxes behind it, leaving me kneeling there with the faint smell of cedar and old paper still in the air, and a stronger feeling now that this garage was more than just a place for forgotten things. It was a place where pieces of her past had been locked away, and I had only just touched the edges. We took a break, not because the work was finished, but because there was a heaviness between us that made moving another box feel impossible for the moment. Clara sat on an overturned milk crate, elbows resting on her knees, her hands loosely clasped together. I leaned against the workbench, wiping my forehead with the back of my arm, though most of the sweat wasn't from the heat, it was from the strange tension that had been building since we opened that trunk. She reached for the stack of letters she'd set aside earlier, the faded red ribbon still holding them together. For a long while she just turned them in her hands, the edges brushing her fingertips, her gaze fixed on some point far beyond the garage wall. Then, without looking up, she pulled one envelope free. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting delicate but a little shaky. She opened it carefully, as though the act itself could cause it to tear, and unfolded the letter inside. Her eyes moved slowly across the words, and I could see her lips tighten. A deep breath left her chest, and she folded it again, not saying a single word about what she'd just read. She placed it back in the envelope and returned it to the ribbon stack as if nothing had happened. I didn't ask. Something told me the answer wouldn't be something you share standing in a dusty garage. Instead, I picked up an old wrench lying nearby and turned it over in my hands, pretending to examine it, just to give her the space to be quiet. The silence between us wasn't empty, it was full of something I couldn't quite name, like standing on the edge of a conversation that would change everything. Eventually, she spoke, but her voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. "It's strange," she said, "how a piece of paper can weigh more than a whole box of books." I wanted to ask who the letters were from, but instead I said, "You don't have to carry it alone, you know." She gave me a look then, one that felt almost like she was trying to measure how much I could be trusted. Then she smiled, but it was the kind of smile that covers more than it reveals. She reached for another letter, but this time she didn't open it. She just held it, pressing the folded paper between her palms for a moment before setting it aside. To fill the quiet, I started talking about some silly story from our high school days, a time when life felt simpler and nothing seemed permanent. She laughed once, just once, and it was small, almost like the sound surprised her. But I could see it, the way her shoulders eased slightly, as if the laugh had loosened something. The light in the garage flickered briefly, the bulb above us buzzing like it was struggling to hold on. I noticed the way she glanced up at it, then back down to her hands, almost grateful for the dimmer light. She looked tired, but not in a physical way, tired in the way someone looks when they've been carrying the same weight for too long without putting it down. She shifted topics suddenly, telling me about an old summer when she and her brother camped out in the backyard, how they'd stayed up all night trying to catch shooting stars. Her voice warmed as she spoke, but even that memory seemed to circle back to something heavier. Her brother's name came up once, and then she quickly steered the story away. I didn't miss the way her fingers tightened around the crate she was sitting on. Outside, a car passed by, its sound muffled but noticeable in the stillness. The garage smelled of dust, oil, and faintly of something floral, the lingering scent of the cedar from the trunk, maybe from her perfume, though she hadn't worn much. She glanced toward the open garage door, her eyes following the car's sound until it faded completely. Then she said, almost to herself, "Some things stay hidden for a reason." I didn't answer. It didn't feel like a line that needed a response. It felt like the kind of truth that just sits between two people until one of them is ready to share the rest. She stood after a moment, brushing the dust from her jeans, and I followed her lead. Without another word, she picked up a small box and placed it in the donation pile, then moved on to the next thing. The break was over, but the shift in her mood was still there, lingering like the dust that floated in the sunbeams from the tiny garage window, settling into every corner we hadn't yet touched. The afternoon light had grown softer by the time we worked our way to the shelves along the side wall, a place cluttered with random items stacked in no particular order. There was an old radio sitting on the middle shelf, its antenna bent and a layer of grime dulling the once shiny knobs. Clara reached for it, her fingers brushing over the dust, and without thinking she turned it on. Static filled the air instantly, the kind of low hiss that seemed to make the whole room feel quieter in comparison. She adjusted the dial, searching for a signal, but only found more static and faint fragments of voices that faded as quickly as they appeared. She didn't switch it off right away. Instead, she stood there, listening, as though that broken noise was saying something only she could hear. I watched her face as she listened. Her eyes weren't focused on the radio, but somewhere far away. After a moment, she turned the knob back to off and set the radio down, her hand lingering on it a second longer than necessary. "That used to play all night," she murmured. "Back when I couldn't sleep." I didn't know what she meant exactly, but I let it pass. We moved to the next shelf and started clearing it off, stacking old mugs, chipped plates, and mismatched glasses into boxes. The dust made me sneeze, and she laughed quietly, covering her mouth as if she'd forgotten how to laugh in front of someone else. Then, as she was reaching for a small snow globe pushed to the back, her hand paused midair. She pulled it out slowly, the glass cloudy, the base scratched, and inside the glitter clung stubbornly to the bottom. She shook it gently, watching the flecks swirl and fall like tired snow. Her expression softened in a way that made me stop what I was doing. She didn't look at me when she spoke. "Do you remember the summer of '09? The question caught me off guard. I searched my memory, thinking back. "Kind of," I said slowly. "That was the year you went away for a bit, right?" She nodded once, still staring into the snow globe. "Yeah. I never told you why." She didn't offer the reason, and I didn't press, but the silence that followed felt heavier than any of the boxes around us. She set the snow globe down beside her, her fingers lingering on it just a moment before pulling away. "That was the year I realized a place can hold a memory like a body holds a scar," she said quietly. I wasn't sure if she was still talking to me or just thinking out loud. The garage felt smaller then, like the walls had drawn in around us. The smell of dust and faint oil was thick in the air, and somewhere outside a dog barked, sharp and distant. Clara crouched down to pull another box from the bottom shelf. Inside were a dozen little items, buttons, marbles, a worn leather bookmark, random things that didn't seem worth keeping, yet she touched each one as though deciding its fate. "This garage," she began, then stopped, her gaze fixed on the jumble in her lap. "It's not just where I keep things. It's where I come to remember. And forget. At the same time." Her voice caught slightly on the last words. I could see her throat tighten as she swallowed. I sat down beside her on the cold concrete floor, unsure if I should speak. Instead, I let her keep going, because I sensed she was balancing on the edge of saying something important. She placed a marble back into the box, rolling it between her fingers first. "Some days, I open a box and it's just junk," she said, her eyes distant. "Other days, it's like opening a wound. And once it's open, you can't close it the same way again. She glanced at me then, and there was a shine in her eyes that she tried to hide by looking away quickly. I wanted to tell her I understood, but I wasn't sure if I did, not completely. The snow globe was still beside her, glitter settled again at the bottom, as if it had never been shaken at all. The static from the radio seemed to echo in my head even though it was off, like the silence it left behind was louder than the noise had been. We worked in silence after that, but it wasn't the same kind of silence from earlier in the day. This one was rawer, the kind that made you aware of every sound, the scrape of boxes on the floor, the shifting of weight on old wooden shelves, the steady rhythm of breathing in a room that seemed to be holding its breath. And all the while, her words replayed in my mind, mixing with the image of her holding that snow globe as though it contained something far heavier than snow and glitter. The shelves were almost bare now, and we had begun clearing the last stretch of clutter along the back wall when my hand brushed against something wedged between two wooden beams. It was small, flat, and covered in so much dust it looked like part of the wall at first. I reached in and pulled it free, coughing as the dust billowed into the air. It was a narrow, faded box, the kind that might have once held jewelry or postcards. The cardboard was soft with age, and when I lifted the lid, I found not trinkets but dozens of folded slips of paper. Each one had a single word written in thick, looping handwriting, Clara's handwriting. Fear. Loss. Shame. Hope. Guilt. There were so many, some creased at the edges as if they had been handled over and over. I held one up to the light, staring at the lonely word printed on it, and then another. The words felt too heavy for their size. Before I could look at more, Clara turned around and froze. Her eyes went straight to the box in my hands, and something in her expression shifted, panic, then something softer, almost like resignation. She stepped closer and reached for it. "I didn't think you'd see these," she said, her voice low but steady. I hesitated before passing it to her, unsure if I had crossed some invisible boundary. She didn't scold me or pull away sharply. Instead, she cradled the box in both hands and lowered herself onto an old stool. For a moment, she just sat there, staring down at the words as if they might rearrange themselves into something easier to face. Then she gave a short, unexpected laugh, dry and almost bitter, but it caught in her throat and broke into quiet sobbing. She pressed the heel of her hand to her eyes, trying to hide it, but her shoulders betrayed her, shaking in small, uneven movements. I stood there, unsure whether to touch her or give her space, and in that hesitation, I realized how much she had been carrying silently. After a moment, I crouched beside her, not saying anything, just letting the closeness speak where words might fail. The garage seemed impossibly still now, the outside world muffled as though we had stepped into a bubble where only this moment existed. She wiped at her face quickly and gave me a tight, fleeting smile. "They're not just words," she said softly, almost like a confession. "Each one, it's a day I didn't talk about. A day I couldn't." She picked up one of the slips, the one that read hope, and held it between her fingers. "Sometimes I kept these because I was afraid I'd forget. Other times, because I wanted to remind myself I'd survived them." Her voice cracked slightly, and she placed it back into the box with care. She didn't explain them all, and I didn't ask her to. Some things didn't need explanations, they just needed to be witnessed. We sat like that for a while, the faint light from the high window settling across the floor in long strips. Dust floated lazily in the air, catching the light like tiny, slow-moving stars. The box of words rested in her lap, and she held it with a grip that was gentle but firm, like it was both fragile and essential. I thought about all the times I had seen Clara over the years, smiling, talking, moving through life as though she were fine, and how I had never suspected she was holding on to something like this. It made me realize how much people can hide behind what they show. Eventually, she closed the lid on the box and hugged it against her chest. "I think I'll keep these out now," she said, her voice a little steadier. "Maybe. I'm ready to look at them without hiding them away." She stood, and I followed, both of us moving slowly as though we'd just been through something we couldn't name. She placed the box gently on the cleared workbench, the same workbench that hours ago had been buried under forgotten tools and clutter. Then she looked at me, not just glanced, but really looked, and for a moment, it felt like she was trying to see if I understood. I didn't have the right words, so I just nodded. We went back to working, the sound of shifting boxes filling the space again, but there was something different now. I wasn't just helping her clean a garage anymore. I was standing inside the private archive of her life, and she had let me see a part of it that wasn't meant for everyone. And somehow, that made the air between us heavier and lighter at the same time. By the time we reached the final few boxes, the daylight had begun to fade, pouring into the garage in soft, angled beams through the small dusty window near the ceiling. The air felt warmer now, not from the weather but from the hours we'd spent moving, sorting, and breathing in the same space, surrounded by the ghosts of her memories. We were quieter than ever, the kind of quiet that isn't awkward but is still thick enough to notice. Clara was bent over a low shelf, pulling out a small stack of magazines, when she suddenly stopped mid-motion. She set them down and stayed there for a moment, still as stone. I asked if she was okay, and she didn't answer right away. When she finally turned toward me, her eyes were searching mine, and her hands were still resting lightly on the edge of the shelf. She stepped closer, slow and deliberate, until there was barely a foot between us. Then, in a voice just above a whisper, she asked, "Do you even know what you're doing to me?" The words landed in the air like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward, breaking whatever calm I thought had settled between us. My mind scrambled to understand what she meant. I opened my mouth, but no answer came. I just stood there, caught between confusion and a strange unease, my heartbeat suddenly too loud in my ears. She didn't look away. Her gaze was steady, not sharp but intense, as if she were willing me to realize something without her having to explain it. Her breathing was shallow, and I noticed her hands had curled into loose fists, like she was holding something back. I wanted to ask what she meant, but the words felt heavy in my throat. Instead, I said her name softly, hoping she'd fill in the rest. She didn't. She stepped back just a little, breaking the closeness, and turned toward the last stack of boxes as if nothing had happened. I watched her for a few seconds before forcing myself to do the same, though my hands felt clumsy and my mind was no longer focused on the work. I kept replaying her question in my head, *, "Do you even know what you're doing to me?" Trying to hear it in different tones, wondering if it was meant as an accusation, a confession, or something else entirely. Each time I thought I had an answer, it slipped away again. She reached into one of the boxes and pulled out a small, worn leather notebook. Without opening it, she traced the edge of the cover with her thumb, then placed it carefully into the keep pile. She glanced at me briefly, and I thought I saw the hint of a smile, not a happy smile, but one of those small, private ones that mean more than they let on. Then it was gone, and she went back to sorting. I tried to focus on the items in front of me, old glass jars, a stack of mismatched coasters, a cracked ceramic mug, but her words kept pressing against my thoughts. The garage felt different now, charged with something invisible but undeniable. Even the air seemed heavier, as if every dust particle was carrying its own secret. The sunlight through the window had shifted, dimming further, and tiny flecks of dust floated in the beams like they were suspended in slow motion. Outside, a bird called once and then fell silent. I realized my hands had stopped moving, that I was standing there holding the same jar for longer than necessary. She didn't seem to notice, or maybe she did and chose not to say anything. When we finally stacked the last box onto the cleared shelf, Clara stepped back and looked around the garage. It was more open now, more orderly, but it still felt like a room full of history that no amount of cleaning could erase. She crossed her arms, hugging herself loosely, and her gaze moved slowly from one corner to another, as if taking inventory not just of the space, but of herself. Then, without turning toward me, she said in a low voice, "Sometimes, it's not the things in the boxes that weigh you down. It's the person who sees you unpack them." I wasn't sure if she meant me or if she was talking about something else entirely. Either way, I didn't reply. I couldn't. Because in that moment, I realized that whatever had happened between us today had shifted something I couldn't name yet, but I knew it wasn't going back to the way it was before. When we finally stepped out of the garage, the evening air felt cooler, fresher, almost too open after the hours spent in that enclosed space heavy with dust and secrets. The sun was low, painting the sky in streaks of amber and pale pink, and the quiet outside felt different, more deliberate, like the world itself was pausing to let something settle between us. Clara closed the garage door slowly, her hands lingering on the handle for a moment before letting it drop with a dull thud. She didn't look at me right away. Instead, she stood there staring at the closed door as if it was keeping more inside than just tools and boxes. I wanted to say something, about her question earlier, about the box of words, about the strange pull I had felt all day, but I couldn't find the right place to start. So we just stood there in the fading light, the silence stretching out, neither of us moving to break it. She finally turned toward me, her expression unreadable but softer than before. Her eyes seemed tired, yet there was a kind of calm there now, like she had set something down that she'd been carrying for too long. She took a small step closer, close enough that I could see the faint smudge of dust along her jawline, and in a voice that was steady but quieter than the breeze, she said, "You don't have to understand everything. Just, don't forget today." I nodded, but the weight of her words made my chest tighten. I knew this wasn't just about cleaning a garage. This was about everything we'd unearthed, not just the objects buried in boxes, but the unspoken parts of her life that had slipped through the cracks for years. The pauses, the lingering touches on certain items, the moments her voice had faltered, they weren't random. They were pieces of a story she had been living alone. And somehow, in being there, I had stepped into it without realizing how deep it went. We walked toward the house together, slow and almost hesitant, as if the air around us might shatter if we moved too quickly. The gravel crunched under our shoes, a sound too loud for the mood we were in. Inside, the warm light of the kitchen spilled onto the porch, but we stopped just short of the door. She turned to me again, and for a brief second, I thought she was going to explain, finally give me the meaning behind her question. Instead, she just gave me a look, one of those looks that hold too many layers for words to untangle. Then she said my name, softly, almost like she was testing how it felt on her tongue. I didn't know what to say back, so I just stood there, my hands in my pockets, the cool air brushing against my skin. She reached for the door handle but paused. Her fingers tightened around it, and without looking at me, she added, "Some things you can't pack away forever. No matter how much you try." Then she pushed the door open and stepped inside, leaving me standing there on the porch, half in the fading light, half in the warm glow spilling out from the house. I followed her in, but the heaviness in my chest stayed. We didn't talk much after that. She made tea, moving quietly around the kitchen, and I sat at the table, watching the steam curl up from the cup she placed in front of me. Every now and then, our eyes would meet, and neither of us would look away right away, but we also didn't speak. The silence wasn't empty, it was full, dense with everything that hadn't been said. I knew when I left that night, I would carry this day with me. The way the light fell through the dusty garage window. The quiet tears she tried to hide. The feel of that box in my hands, heavy with folded words. And most of all, the question she had asked me, one I still didn't have an answer for. Long after I drove away, the image of her standing there in the garage, looking at me with something unspoken in her eyes, stayed in my mind. And even now, I can still hear her voice, soft and steady, asking, "Do you even know what you're doing to me?" I didn't then. Maybe I still don't. But I know I'll never forget it. If this story touched you, share it with someone who understands the weight of unspoken moments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me, what do you think she meant? Your thoughts matter here, and I'd love to hear them.